Hello, humans. Welcome to The Frontline, a leadership and business podcast brought to you by Peregrine Corporate Services, an Isle of Man-based fiduciary provider. My name is Martin Hall, and thanks for listening. Today I'm joined by Joe of FDS. Thanks for joining us today, Joe.
My pleasure.
Just to help the listeners get a little bit of background, perhaps you can let us know where you were originally sort of brought up and schooling years.
Okay. Brought up in God's own country in Yorkshire. Went to school there. Went to Huddersfield Technical College because I wasn't good enough to pass the 11 plus and go to grammar school. Sadly, my mother died when I was quite young, and then my father's business went bust, and the 3-day week, and I think these are seminal moments that change your personality. So it made me very driven, very independent, and determined to succeed. So I wasn't particularly any type of bright spark at school, but when I went to Huddersfield Technical College, there was a wonderful inspirational teacher there who told me I could do anything I like, and I ended up doing well in my A-levels and was the first of my family to go to university to study law, and then I went on to qualify.
All right, okay. And why law particularly? Was that just an area of interest at the time, or?
To be honest, I think it was mostly that there was the teacher at the
Right.
technical college. He was an ex-barrister and he was extremely engaging. He made it sound very exciting and interesting, and you know, sometimes it just needs one person, doesn't it, to tell you what you are capable of, and he inspired me.
It's interesting then. So when you look back, you mentioned there about your drive. Was that something you were aware of then at that age, or it's maybe more in hindsight that you look back and realise those circumstances created that drive?
I knew that I never wanted to be in the position where I was when I was a sort of a young teenager, because of what had happened to my mother and then my dad's business, and I felt out of control, and therefore I was determined that I would always be in charge of my own destiny.
Okay. So just a quick question, a 3-day week, I've not come across that before. What was that?
That's because you're not old enough. So back in the 1970s, when the miners were on strike, all the businesses went on a 3-day week because they turned the electricity off at various points in a day.
Okay, right.
And my father was in children's clothing, making children's clothing, and obviously just couldn't operate the business effectively.
Yeah.
And so he went bankrupt.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I've not heard of that before. So then you move into working life. Where does that begin?
Well, having been to university and then I trained as a lawyer, I realised it wasn't boring enough, so I went on to train to be an accountant. I found that those two skills in sort of being able to speak lawyer and speak accountant put me in very good stead for a career in the financial sector. And I worked originally for a company called Cannon Street Investments, who were an amalgamator of businesses, had a buy-build strategy, and I worked with them as company secretary and finance, and sort of helping them do their acquisitions, and worked in-house at one of their businesses for quite a while. And then, you know, I'm married now and I've got 4 children, and I'm thinking, I don't want to do this for somebody else where I have no control now over my time or my life. And so I decided to set up my own company, which is 30 years old this year.
Right, okay. And where this was all based in the area you were brought up in, I assume?
Well, Cannon Street were in London, so I was working partly in London, partly in Yorkshire. But I set up my own business in Yorkshire, but I do have a London office and a Birmingham site as well now.
So that step then into, in essence, becoming an entrepreneur, was that a daunting prospect at the time?
I don't think I actually thought about it, to be honest. I mean, my mother had taken over my grandfather's sheet metal engineering business when he died. You know, she was in her 20s and had been a secretary before that. And then my dad had started his own business. And I suppose I came from this sort of if you like, entrepreneurial family, but I think it was more sort of they were just running businesses. I'm not sure they thought of themselves as entrepreneurs, and neither did I. I would think I am now, because I'm constantly thinking of new ideas, and I have got a reasonable appetite for risk, although that changes as you get older. But I have taken lots of risk, and I think that's what an entrepreneur does.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And I enjoy the journey.
And did you have a clear like on day one? Did you have a clear vision of what you were looking to achieve with that business?
Of course, I didn't. Had no idea at all. One of the things I've done in lockdown actually is I've written a book called and I've written a few books, but this is one I've written recently called So You Want to Start a New Business, Do You? And I've been reflecting on my own journey on that. Everything from the name of the business to the branding to what I perceived it would do. But at the time, I just did it. Okay. I just wanted to be in charge of what I did when I did it, and I wanted to enjoy it and work for myself. But I didn't have any grand plans. Mm-hmm. It's the John Lennon song, isn't it? Life happens while you're busy making plans.
Yeah, it's just interesting. You mentioned, obviously, I don't know whether you had 4 kids at the time you set up that business, but even to have some children, and that, I guess that, again, one of the previous guests we chatted to was about that big step into potentially not earning income yet having a family to support.
Yeah. I mean, what I did when I very first started is because I had a fantastic job. I had a great salary, a flash car and bonuses, and so there is quite a jump to make there. But what I did was I took a 3-day-a-week contracting job for 6 months that gave me enough security to pay mortgage and bills and what have you. But it gave me 2 days a week to explore the possibilities. After 6 months, I dropped that contract down to 2 days a week because they wanted me to stay on. And so I swapped it round. But that also then gave me more time. And funnily enough, the first person I recruited in my business was not another fee earner, but was a marketeer. Oh, because right. What I realised is that it's all very well doing jobs for people, which I was loving, but when I was busy doing it, I wasn't marketing the business. And that was a bit scary because, of course, they weren't bringing any money. But then it just went absolutely, it skyrocketed because she was bringing in all this work, and then I didn't have anybody to deliver it except me. But it was a nice problem to have.
Yeah.
I don't regret that at all.
Yeah, I'd imagine. Well, again, that's a big. I wouldn't use the word risk, but a big.
It wasn't.
Yeah. I suppose it's not what a lot of people would think is a logical step, like you say. So
It was a risk because that meant now not only did I have to pay all my bills, but I also had to pay somebody else as well as myself. But it more than paid off, and that's because I got the right person to do it.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's always important, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the first few years, or the first period of that business, how what were you primarily focused on? What were you doing?
Well, the FDS originally stood for Finance Director Services, and what I was doing was the aim was to provide finance directors stroke company secretary legal services into companies who were doing a transaction or who were going through a period of high growth or even trouble, and they needed some restructuring. And that's what it was originally called. Now, when I did that, when I set up the business, that was quite an unusual model. Now it's a very well-trod path, but it wasn't so much then. And again, I was reflecting on this when I was writing my book, that the idea was I was going to populate my business with associates who would deliver these services. But the biggest problem I had is I couldn't find accountants and lawyers who had a personality. I mean, it is a bit of an oxymoron, really, to find people in those professions who can sell and who are persuasive and who can help owner managers deal through problems, because that's not what we were trained to do.
Right.
So I started to diversify because I couldn't find the right people. And we started tagging on other things like non-exec director services, training and development for boards, where I could find people. And that's how the business grew. That was never in my plans, but it does happen because I couldn't find the right people to do what I was doing, but I had to, and I wanted to grow the business.
Okay. So maybe looking at some of those things like the non-exec roles, those types of things, maybe start with something I was reading on your LinkedIn profile, maybe public speaking as a start. That's something you can help people with, for example.
Well, I don't teach public speaking, but I speak at about 120 events a year. Okay. For various organisations in-house and on open programmes. But I speak on governance, on board governance, building world-class boards, and on corporate finance, and on finance for the terrified, and that sort of stuff. I don't teach public speaking.
Yeah, okay.
There are plenty of people that do. But that's also been a really positive addition to my business, because if I speak on stage at some event or other, or do something in-house, they inevitably, well, hopefully buy into you as an individual. It develops trust, and therefore when they want other services that we can provide, they're much more likely to contact me.
Yeah. Okay. What I was going to ask around public speaking was that something that was natural to you, or something you had to learn yourself?
No, wasn't natural at all. In fact, I remember when I started to decide to do this, I actually went on a public speaking course to upskill, really. And I still get terrible stage fright whenever I'm doing it. And I mean, considering I speak at well over 100 events a year, I always have this sort of butterflies in my tummy before I stand on stage.
Right.
I think that's an important part of being a good speaker, that you don't take anything for granted.
Yeah. So are you then often driven by, again, we talk about that driven side of it, but you're putting yourself into an uncomfortable position on a constant basis. Do you feel for anyone in business, they need to do that on a regular basis?
Well, I wouldn't say to make yourself uncomfortable. I would say you've got to push yourself. Yeah. You've got to push the boundaries. Otherwise, it all becomes a little bit, boring, really. Right. I'm always striving to do something different. I'm not somebody that's going to jump out of a plane with a parachute. That is not my idea of a thrill. Right. My idea of a thrill is to come up with a new business idea. And I've launched 2 new business divisions again in lockdown. Right. Because I get bored.
Yeah, right. Interesting. So you mentioned there about building world-class boards. You maybe expand kind of the area, what you achieve, what you do in there, and how you achieve that. Appreciate a pretty broad question, but.
Well, building a world-class board is a bit like building a world-class marriage. You have to work at it, and it takes all sorts of skills to create that high-performing group of people. You need diversity in all senses, not just age and ethnicity and gender, but thought. So, you don't want people who necessarily have the same personality type. Unfortunately, boards are not generally like that. And if I do usually a little poll with a group of board members that I'm talking about, so many of them are of the same genre.
Okay.
Then you need a diverse set of people around there. They need to understand what great looks like. They need to understand what their role and responsibilities are. And there's so many people who aspire to be directors without any understanding of what it means legally, let alone the responsibilities that they have, on an individual basis. Yeah. And then you've got to work at improving it all the time. So churn is an important part of board development. Nobody is immortal, and few boards invest in succession planning.
Yeah, you mentioned churn then, did you? What do you think about that too?
So, if you've got somebody sitting on the board for 25 years and they haven't had any other external experience, they're going to get stale.
Yeah. Okay.
So you do need to have people come and go, not like a revolving door, but you do need a certain amount of people bringing new ideas, even if that's just a non-exec quarter of the board, who are going to challenge and bring new contacts and new initiatives and so on. And you can't do that if you sit on the same board all the time. In fact, if you look at what the UK Corporate Governance Code says, it says that non-exec directors shouldn't sit for more than three-year terms.
Yeah. Okay. And when you're dealing with, let's say, more senior people, how do you find, and it's a subject I've been reading a bit about recently, when you look at people's egos, I think the reality is we all have them in some format. I'd imagine you go into certain businesses and there's more of it. How do you tend to if you have to give advice to people for handling people's egos?
Everybody's got a certain amount of ego. I mean, including myself. You all want to be perceived as being the best possible. But I'm very careful who I work with. One of the tests I use for whether I'm going to work with a board or not is, could I bear to spend a long haul flight with the CEO in cattle class?
Uh-huh.
Am I going to get on with them? Do we share the same values? And if they're so egotistical that won't work, then I'm not going to work with them.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm in a fortunate position maybe where I can pick and choose.
Yeah.
But we all have a certain amount of choice, and I don't want to work with egomaniacs. I mean, I have done over the years, but it's just usually been so chuffing miserable, as we say up in Yorkshire, that I'm not going to. Life's too short to work with people that I don't get on with. They're not going to be my best mates.
Yeah.
Looking to make these lifelong friends, but I do want to get on with them. I want us to be able to talk honestly and openly, have a row if needed, and then move on. And I can't. I'm not prepared to work with egotistical people.
Yeah. And if you look at, walk into any board today, or if you had advice for a board today to, I guess they should always be reflecting on what they're doing. But if you had advice for them, have you got sort of key points that you'd always tell a board to be thinking about and considering?
Well, I've already mentioned succession planning. One of the things I set out to do when I first start with the board is to say, what are the 6 critical things that you as a company need to achieve this year? Have you got them on the board agenda? Have you assigned responsibility for those tasks to board members? Are they reporting into the board about them? And to think of those as I usually use the phrase to turn the gas up and down on the business. If you deliver these things, the vision that you had at the start of this process, you will have delivered it.
Yeah.
But because most boards are owner managed boards, and they've got different hats on. They've got a shareholder hat on, a management hat, and a director hat on. They're never quite sure what role they're holding in a debate. Whereas if you can get them to focus on the big critical success factors, then they will have a better performing company. The other thing is, I would say, and public companies have to do this per the UK Corporate Governance Code, is to at least periodically have an external person come and review you as a board and give you some constructive, critical feedback and take it on board and do something about it.
Yeah. Okay. And would you recommend it's good practice for whether PLC or not, but that's good practice?
I think it is good practice. I think for a smaller company, you don't necessarily, have to do it every year. If you're a public company, you have to do it every year, and every 3 years you have to bring in a third party to do it. But I think for a private company, it is something you should at least do every 3 years.
Yeah.
But you need to do it. There are loads of things on Google on board evaluations, but the best thing is to have an external person come in, talk to everybody, observe a meeting, and then give some constructive, critical feedback to make changes.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it's all about self-reflection, and that's not going to be independent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when you look at or we chat about NEDs, what do you expect to see as key roles of an NED?
The main role of a non-exec director is to constructively challenge the executives, to provide contacts, to mentor and support the CEO, if you're the chair, Ned, to be available, to help the company keep on track from a planning point of view, particularly in an owner-managed board, to keep them away from operational discussions in the board and focus on strategic targets, and make sure that good governance practices are maintained. So you've got proper records, got a proper agenda, people are reporting in, they're held accountable, decisions are made.
Yeah. Okay, switch subject slightly. You mentioned there earlier about booking, and you've had a number of publications. When you
all available on Amazon.
Okay, yeah. Well, that was one question, and then the other one, I suppose, out of all the ones, have you got a particular one that stands out for yourself?
Well, the one I wrote last year, and I usually try and write one a year. The one I wrote last year was How to be a World-Class Non-Exec Director, and that is just literally flying off the shelves.
All right, okay.
And I think because there is this appetite for portfolio careers, but a lack of understanding of the difference between being a consultant and being a non-exec director, and it's a really practical book. And that's doing really well. But the reason I've wrote this new book, which should be coming out sort of August, September, is because I think after COVID, there'll be an appetite for starting your own business.
Okay.
And I've made it extremely practical. This isn't an academic text, because that's just not, it's written in my voice, and it's based on my experiences of what works and what doesn't. And, in fact, my lovely assistant who's been typing it up said, this is more like memoirs, Jo. And I said, well, I started my business 30 years ago. It is a reflection on what worked and what didn't.
Yeah, okay. To come back to the books in a moment, you mentioned there people starting on businesses out of COVID. Your thought process behind why you feel that way?
Well, I think there'll be a lot of people who will lose their jobs. I think there'll be a lot of people who have been not treated very well through this process. And there'll be a lot of people go, I'm never going to be in this situation again. I am going to never be unemployed, because I will employ myself, and I may have, high days and low days. And I reflect on that in my book. There's been many times when I haven't been able to pay myself a salary, but there's been other times where I've had a fantastic lifestyle out of it.
Yeah.
But I will never, ever be out of work. And that was important to me. And I think that will resonate with a lot of people after this.
Okay. And to go back to the book point, when you first looked at doing your first publication and book, was that, again, you mentioned earlier about getting some training for public speaking. Is that something, again, did you go and seek help with that, or did you just start scribbling?
So what happened was I did an event telling stories of governance and so on, and I didn't know, but in the audience there was a publisher, and they came up to me at the end and they said, Jo, we'd like to publish a book on what you've been talking about. That was my first book, called The Business Rules, and they were wonderful in terms of editing. There were a company called Piacticus who then sold out to Little Brown, who of course are a massive publishing company, and their editors were wonderful with me.
Right.
And since then I've written a number for other different publishers and so on, but I did write in my own voice, and that is what I most enjoy.
Yeah, okay. I
didn't want to write academic books. It's not my style.
Okay, yeah. And outside of your own publications, what would you recommend for listeners to read?
It depends what they're.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I was just been listening to a fantastic podcast called How to Fail.
Okay.
My children referred it to me, and it's absolutely brilliant.
Okay. We'll add a link in our footnotes. I'll get that off you. We'll add a link into our footnotes, as well as a link to some of your books on Amazon there. And then
sure, thank you.
Your profiles. No, not at all. It'd be good for people to reach out and pick those up.
I think this is sort of a bit of a fear of failure, and this lady, speaks, again, it's in her voice, of all the things she's failed at and what she's learned from it. And this is, I only was listening to it yesterday, but obviously I was also reflecting in my book, oh gosh, this went wrong, this went horribly wrong, oh God, why did I do that? But from it, there are a series of things that you think, I won't do it that way again.
Yeah.
I had to fail to learn that.
Yeah, a lot of that. I mean, I listen to a bit of motivational stuff, and they talk about, everything's failing's more important than the succeeding part of things. And you take it back to your childhood, and when you first try to walk and you fall over, and then it's a failure, and that's just then carried on through your life, isn't it? In different formats. So yeah, failure is not. It's not a bad. If anything, it's a good thing, and you should.
But as I was growing up, that wasn't acceptable. Definitely, and I failed my 11 plus, and I got terrible O levels, and so I considered myself a failure until this chap told me, "No, you're not. Just haven't found your vocation yet."
Yeah. I could be wrong, but I suspect that's part of what drives you now as well. I suspect.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So just a last quick question. With certainly, I'm not going to boast, but on the Isle of Man, with lockdown finished and COVID sort of certainly on the Isle of Man.
I know all your restaurants are open now.
Yeah, we're all happily getting together and getting drunk now.
Yeah, sounds fabulous.
But from a business perspective, how's that affected yourself? Not the getting drunk bit, the COVID bit.
We have never been as busy, to be honest. I just didn't know what would happen at this, and at the start of it, I asked my MD to reforecast the whole business, assuming that we would lose a lot of business. We haven't lost any. We've run loads, and I've started these 2 new divisions, one on crowdfunding and one on employee ownership trusts, and it's just gone viral. And so we are as busy as ever, but obviously I do have some clients who are struggling, and where I'm non-exec director, I'm there to support them. And I totally appreciate businesses are struggling, but I do believe that it's the SME sector who will turn it round. We have to, because it's our living. So we have got to make this work, and we've got to be creative. And there's so much creativity going on there, going on in businesses who are making things work because they've got no choice.
Yeah. Like I say, we briefly met a couple of moments before the podcast. We'd not met before, but my sort of initial instinct, you're obviously very driven, but I suspect you probably don't sleep much, and you're very busy.
Actually, I do like to sleep. I usually go to bed. I do go to bed early. I like to have 8 hours sleep, and I do like to sleep. Not saying I always achieve that, but I am very driven, and I am very, very good at multitasking, and I am blessed with loads of energy. And whilst I'm the oldest person in my business, my team say, "Joe, you've got more energy than any of us."
Yeah, I'd imagine that leads into the team, that energy, enthusiasm, the drive.
It's so funny you should use the word high energy. I've been doing a lot of sort of Zoom presentations and so on instead of face-to-face, and that is the phrase that is often repeated to me. "Joe, you are such high energy." And this is me. This is how I am. I'm not, I don't switch it on and off. This is, if this is what high energy is, then clearly that is me.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously going to help very much in business as well. So what we'll do is, as I mentioned, we'll add in the footnotes if people want to reach out. I'm sure you'll be happy for people to reach out to you, Joe. We'll put on your LinkedIn. Website is wearefds.com.
Correct.
And then some links to a couple of those books and that podcast you mentioned as well, which I'll add to my ever-growing list of things to listen and watch. So thanks for joining us today,
My
Joe.
pleasure.
It's been really interesting.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for listening, everyone.